At 2 in the morning, 300 miles off the coast of New Zealand, a deep water trawler's sonar operator watched a shape cross his screen that made him call the captain out of his bunk. It was not a whale. Whales have a signature, a rhythm, a shape that decades of commercial fishing had taught this crew to recognize instantly, almost without thinking. This was longer, denser, and it was moving against the current at a speed that made no sense for anything that size. By the time the captain reached the bridge, the contact was gone, swallowed back into water nearly 4,000 meters deep, and the screen showed nothing but the ordinary static of an empty sea. The crew logged it, the way sailors have logged strange contacts for centuries, filed it under unexplained, and went back to work, because that is what you do when the ocean shows you something it refuses to explain. Nobody thought that report would end up, years later, inside a folder, being fed line by line into an artificial intelligence system built by one of the richest men on the planet. Nobody thought a chatbot would be asked the one question marine biology has spent a century insisting was already answered. Is Megalodon actually extinct? And nobody, least of all the researchers who typed that question into Grok, expected the answer they got back to feel less like a confirmation and more like a warning. To understand why that answer landed like a punch to the chest, you have to understand what Megalodon actually was, because the popular image, the movie monster with rows of cartoonish teeth, barely scratches the surface of how genuinely terrifying this animal was in real life. Otodus Megalodon ruled the oceans for roughly 20 million years, appearing in the fossil record around 23 million years ago, and, according to the official paleontological timeline, vanishing somewhere around 3.6 million years ago. Estimates built from vertebrae, jaw reconstructions, and the enormous serrated teeth it left scattered across ocean floors worldwide put its length at somewhere between 50 and 65 feet, with some outlier estimates pushing even higher. That is longer than a city bus, heavier than a fully loaded semi-truck, with a bite force that some researchers have calculated at over 40,000 pounds per square inch, several times stronger than a modern great white, and enough to crush the skeleton of a whale in a single closing of its jaw. Its teeth, some over 7 inches long and dense enough to survive millions of years underwater, still wash up on beaches from the Carolinas to Peru to the coasts of Australia. Fossilized relics of an animal that dominated the food chain so completely it had almost no natural predator of its own, ruling as the undisputed apex hunter of an entire prehistoric ocean. The official story is that the world eventually changed under Megalodon's fins. The oceans cooled during a significant climatic shift roughly 3.5 million years ago, part of a broader planetary transition that reshaped coastlines and currents across the globe. Sea levels dropped. Coastal nursery habitats, the shallow warm water bays where juvenile Megalodon likely grew large enough to survive the dangers of open ocean, began disappearing beneath changing shorelines. Its prey, particularly the smaller whale species it depended on for survival, thinned out or shifted their migration patterns entirely, as food chains adjusted to the cooling world. Around the same time, a new competitor was rising fast through the ranks, a leaner, faster, more adaptable predator called the great white shark, which some researchers argue outcompeted Megalodon for the dwindling supply of large marine prey, slowly starving the giant out of relevance, extinct, case closed. That is what every textbook, every museum placard, and every peer-reviewed extinction study for the last century has confidently stated, treating the matter as settled science with the same certainty applied to the disappearance of the dinosaurs. For the vast majority of marine biologists, that has been the end of the conversation. One more casualty filed alongside mammoths and saber-toothed cats, a closed chapter in the long, cold history of a planet in constant flux. But a small group of researchers, some independent, some quietly affiliated with oceanographic institutions, who did not want their names publicly attached to what critics would immediately dismiss as cryptid nonsense, decided to test that certainty against a resource nobody had ever pointed at this question before. Not a research vessel, not a submersible. An artificial intelligence system trained to process enormous quantities of information without the built-in professional incentive to protect a tidy, career-safe conclusion. They chose Grok, the AI developed by xAI, specifically because of its design philosophy, a system explicitly built to entertain uncomfortable questions, rather than deflect them with the kind of institutional caution that governs most polished chatbot responses on sensitive or fringe topics. They were not interested in a rehearsed textbook answer that simply repeated the consensus. They wanted to know what would happen if you handed a machine 2 centuries of raw, unfiltered ocean data and asked it to find a shape in the noise without ever telling it what shape it was supposed to find. And that is the detail that matters most here. The researchers did not walk in and ask Grok, point blank, does Megalodon still exist? That would have been essentially worthless. An open invitation for the model to simply regurgitate the scientific consensus already sitting inside its training data. The same consensus every textbook already repeats without hesitation. Instead, they built something closer to a blind dataset. Thousands of individual entries pulled from decades of sonar logs, from long-line fishing records showing carcasses with bite radii too large for any known predator, from Coast Guard incident files stretching back generations, from oceanographic buoy anomalies quietly flagged and forgotten, from newspaper archives reaching back more than 150 years, and from deep-sea survey expeditions that had noted unexplained large object contacts and simply moved on, because nobody had the budget or professional appetite to chase down something that might end their credibility. They stripped out anything that mentioned Megalodon by name. They stripped out sensational language, folklore, and speculation, leaving behind only the driest possible skeleton of data. What Grok received was coordinates, depths, water temperatures, estimated dimensions, and dates, nothing more, and it was simply asked whether the data showed structure or whether it showed noise, the same question a statistician might ask of any unexplained cluster of numbers. The reason this experiment carries any real weight at all is because of just how little we actually know about the ocean floor beneath us. Less than a quarter of the seafloor has been mapped with anything close to the resolution scientists currently use to study the surface of Mars, a fact that still surprises most people when they first hear it. The deep midwater zone, the vast lightless layer, separating the sunlit shallows from the crushing dark of the abyssal plain, is so poorly explored that entirely new species of large marine animals are still being discovered there almost every single year, sometimes multiple times a year. The colossal squid, a creature that can reach nearly 15 meters in length and possesses the largest eyes of any animal on Earth, was not filmed alive in its natural habitat until 2025. An astonishing fact, given how long humanity has been sailing the seas. The megamouth shark, a filter-feeding species reaching 15 feet in length with a mouth wide enough to swallow a grown man whole, was completely unknown to science until 1976, when a U.S. Navy vessel accidentally snagged one on an anchor line off the coast of Hawaii. And perhaps most famous of all is the coelacanth, a fish that scientists confidently declared extinct alongside the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, right up until a living specimen was hauled out of a fishing net off the coast of South Africa in 1938, upending an entire branch of paleontology overnight and forcing textbooks to be quietly rewritten. If a fish that size, and a shark that size, could evade every research vessel and every fisherman on the planet for millions of years, the question of what else might still be hiding in that unmapped darkness stops being a fringe question and becomes, arguably, one of the most important open questions in marine science today. When the researchers first ran the raw geographic data through Grok, the initial output looked exactly like what any skeptic would expect: a scattered mess of points with no discernible pattern, essentially a map of human paranoia plotted loosely against a coastline. That is the boring answer, the expected answer, the one that would have ended the entire project within a single afternoon of work. It looked, at first glance, like proof that these reports were nothing more than misidentified great whites, driftwood shadows in low light, and frightened imaginations doing what frightened imaginations always do near deep, dark water. But when the researchers asked Grok to cross-reference those same points against water temperature and depth simultaneously, layering the variables together instead of examining them in isolation, something in the output shifted noticeably. The scattered chaos tightened into a corridor, a narrow band of temperature and depth that repeated itself again and again across wildly different oceans and wildly different decades. A sonar anomaly logged off the coast of Chile in the 1970s, and a sonar anomaly logged in the South Pacific in 2019, separated by nearly 50 years and thousands of miles, were sitting inside the exact same narrow thermal envelope. The kind of transitional zone where cold, nutrient-rich water from the deep ocean rises to meet warmer surface currents. An upwelling zone, precisely the sort of ecosystem that concentrates prey and, historically, concentrates apex predators along with it. That alone might have been dismissed as coincidence. The kind of pattern matching an AI system is sometimes accused of manufacturing out of thin air simply because it was told to look hard enough for something. So the researchers pushed further, feeding Grok the estimated sizes drawn from witness accounts and instrument readings, fully expecting the numbers to be essentially worthless. Human beings are famously bad at judging the size of anything moving through open water, particularly at night or in poor visibility. And 2 centuries of panicked estimates should have produced nothing but a meaningless spray of numbers ranging anywhere from 20 feet to well over 100. Instead, once the obvious exaggerations and clear folklore entries were filtered out, a cluster emerged, a size range that was consistently, stubbornly larger than any confirmed living shark species, yet nowhere near the cartoonish extremes of monster movie fantasy that skeptics might have expected. It landed squarely inside the range paleontologists themselves assigned to Megalodon, based purely on fossilized vertebrae and jaw reconstructions. A range nobody had told Grok to expect, because nobody had told it what animal it was even supposed to be looking for in the first place. The researchers, understandably suspicious of their own results, tried to break the pattern deliberately. because that is what good methodology demands. They worried that whoever had originally compiled these reports across the decades had unconsciously cherry-picked the ones that fit the legend, favoring dramatic accounts over mundane ones without even realizing it. So they reran the analysis using the full, uncleaned archive, including every entry the original compilers had flagged as a probable hoax or an obvious exaggeration. If the size cluster was simply an artifact of selective compiling, adding the junk back in should have dissolved it completely into noise within minutes. It did not dissolve. The noise around the edges did widen exactly as expected, spreading the numbers out the way genuine contamination should, but the core cluster underneath stayed precisely where it had been, sharper, if anything, once the equipment coverage was corrected for, because certain instrument-dense regions had been artificially inflating the numbers. A real pattern is supposed to survive contamination. A story people simply tell each other is supposed to collapse the moment you stop carefully curating it. This one refused to collapse, no matter how much unfiltered material was thrown back into the mix. Then came the detail that reportedly unsettled the researchers more than anything else in the entire process. When Grok was given the dates of these reports and asked to sort them not by calendar month but by regional ocean current cycles, the pattern that emerged had nothing to do with human tourism, seasons, fishing seasons, or boating traffic. The boring explanation everyone had quietly braced themselves to accept as the final answer. Instead, in the Northern Hemisphere, the credible reports clustered tightly around the specific weeks each year when a particular deep, cold current pushed hardest against a warmer continental shelf. And in the Southern Hemisphere, the same clustering occurred around the mirrored seasonal upwelling event on the opposite side of the calendar, 6 months apart but identical in mechanism. The reports were not following the rhythm of human summer vacations and fishing licenses. They were following the rhythm of the ocean itself, a rhythm no casual witness would have any conceivable reason to know, let alone fabricate a consistent story around, across 200 years, multiple hemispheres, and thousands of unconnected individuals who never read each other's accounts. At this point, the research team did something that speaks to their credibility rather than undermining it. Instead of running toward the exciting conclusion the way a headline-hungry outlet might, they spent weeks trying to systematically destroy their own result using every conventional explanation available to them. They tested whether the clustering was simply a shadow of human presence, overlaying shipping lane traffic, commercial fishing density, coastal population growth, and even historical camera and smartphone ownership rates onto the sighting map, reasoning that if people simply see strange things wherever enough people happen to be looking, the mystery should dissolve the moment human density was properly accounted for. It did not dissolve. If anything, the opposite happened. The busiest shipping corridors and the most crowded coastal waters did produce plenty of reports, exactly as expected. But those reports behaved exactly like ordinary noise. No consistent depth, no consistent temperature, no consistent size, precisely what you would expect from misidentified whales, breaching dolphins, and startled boaters. The tight, consistent cluster sat somewhere else entirely, hugging the edges where the crowded, warm continental shelf dropped away into cold, empty, unwatched water, appearing not where the most people were, but where the fewest people happened to be standing at the exact moment the deep current surged upward. They tested instrument bias next, worried that modern sonar and oceanographic survey equipment simply concentrated wherever the most interesting underwater terrain happened to be, which could artificially manufacture a false cluster, purely because that is where the best sensors were pointed and calibrated. Correcting for equipment coverage did trim a handful of contacts that turned out to be artifacts of a single, heavily surveyed trench, a legitimate false positive removed cleanly from the data, but the core of the pattern held tighter and cleaner than before rather than weaker or more diffuse. They tested known animal behavior next, feeding Grok the documented migration routes, depth preferences, and thermal tolerances of every large living shark and filter feeder currently on record. And while a meaningful portion of the credible sightings did fold neatly into those known profiles, offering a mundane and satisfying explanation for a real chunk of the data, a stubborn remainder simply would not fit any known species, consistently larger, consistently deeper, and locked into a seasonal rhythm that matched nothing in the reference library of confirmed marine life anywhere on the planet. They even tested for hoax clustering, the well-documented tendency for fabricated sightings to spike sharply around viral documentaries, popular movies, and major media events. And Grok found those spikes easily sitting in obviously different locations, obviously different months, and obviously different size ranges than the deeper, quieter, more consistent signal running underneath. By the end of that process, the researchers had not set out to prove Megalodon was alive. They had set out, in good faith and with genuine scientific discipline, to prove that it was not, using every reasonable, boring, defensible explanation available to them, and one by one, those explanations only ever explained a portion of the picture, peeling away the noise, and leaving behind a residue that grew cleaner and more concentrated with every single test, rather than dissolving into nothing the way a false pattern is supposed to. That is not how coincidence typically behaves under sustained scrutiny. A fluke usually falls apart the harder you push against it. This one hardened with every attempt to break it. It is critically important at this point to be honest about what this analysis actually proves, and just as importantly, what it does not prove. It does not prove that Megalodon is currently alive and swimming somewhere in the deep Pacific. Nobody has filmed one. Nobody has recovered a fresh carcass, a tooth with soft tissue still attached, or any usable DNA evidence whatsoever. And in the total absence of that kind of hard physical proof, mainstream marine biology remains firmly, confidently anchored to the extinction timeline established by decades of careful fossil study and radiometric dating. What the analysis does suggest, cautiously and without leaping recklessly past the evidence, is that something coherent and consistent appears to be generating a pattern across centuries of scattered reports, a pattern that does not behave like random human error, does not behave like a media-driven hoax cycle, and does not fully match any known documented species currently sitting on record anywhere in the scientific literature. Whether that pattern points toward an undiscovered population of a genuinely ancient predator, a known species behaving in ways science has simply never had the opportunity to observe closely enough to document, or some entirely different oceanographic phenomena nobody has properly modeled yet, the raw geometry of the data cannot say on its own. It can only insist, quietly and stubbornly, that the silence has a shape, and that the shape is not the shape of nothing at all. What makes this particular moment feel different from 100 years of grainy photographs and campfire stories passed down through generations of fishermen is the nature of the tool that found it. Grok was never fed the legend directly. It was never told what it was supposed to discover, and it carries no career to protect, no tenure to defend, no reputation riding on either thrilling the public or reassuring a skeptical scientific establishment eager to move on. It has no capacity to hope there's a monster hiding in the deep, and no professional incentive whatsoever to insist there is not. It was simply handed raw numbers, stripped of context and mythology, and asked what shape those numbers made. And the shape it reported back was not random. When a system with genuinely nothing at stake returns, a structure this consistent, that consistency becomes very difficult to simply wave away as coincidence, even for researchers who walked into this project expecting, and in many cases honestly hoping, to prove nothing at all had ever happened out there. And the archive keeps growing every single day. More vessels carry sonar today than at any point in human history. More divers, more remote-operated cameras, more autonomous underwater drones are actively watching more of the ocean than existed even a decade ago, and every fresh contact gets logged, time-stamped, and folded straight back into the same expanding dataset Grok first analyzed months earlier. If this pattern really was nothing more than an illusion built from selective memory and human bias accumulating over generations, the flood of new, higher quality data should have drowned it out by now, smoothing the anomaly into statistical nothing the way genuine noise always eventually does. So far, according to the researchers still quietly tracking this project, that has simply not happened. The newest reports keep landing inside the same depth corridor, the same temperature band, the same seasonal window the original analysis flagged years earlier, submitted by ordinary people who have never heard of this project and have absolutely no idea their sighting is falling exactly where the geometry predicted it would land long before they ever stepped onto a boat. So where does that leave anyone listening to this right now? It leaves two entirely reasonable readings sitting side by side, and honest, intelligent people can land on either one without being foolish. The first reading says, the pattern is real, but it is a pattern of human behavior rather than biology. A reflection of where frightened people, productive fishing grounds, and modern sensors simply happen to overlap consistently enough across 2 centuries that it starts to resemble design, even though nothing actually designed it at all. The second reading says a pattern that survives every deliberate attempt to destroy it, that sharpens instead of dissolving under sustained scrutiny, and that keeps being independently confirmed by fresh, unrelated contacts with no knowledge of what they are supposedly confirming, deserves considerably more respect than a shrug and a joke about a bad movie franchise. Mainstream science, for now, stands firmly and reasonably with extinction, and that consensus is built on genuine, careful fossil evidence spanning millions of years that should never be casually dismissed. But the ocean has surprised us before, more than once, more recently than most people realize, and less than a quarter of it has ever been properly seen by human eyes or human instruments in any meaningful detail. So here is the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. When a machine with nothing to gain and nothing to fear is handed 2 centuries of raw, unfiltered deep-water reports, and hands back a pattern that stubbornly refuses to behave like an illusion, no matter how hard careful researchers try to break it. Do you see the fingerprint of ordinary human fear repeating itself quietly across generations of sailors and fishermen? Or do you see the outline of something enormous still moving through the vast, dark parts of the ocean? We have simply never managed to watch closely enough to understand? The data will not answer that question for you, and it was never designed to. It only insists, quietly and consistently, that the silence has a shape, and that somewhere beneath the corridor where cold water rises to meet warm generation after generation, that shape has never once gone away.